They said I was cursed with a face that could make mirrors crack. They whispered behind my back, pointing at my crooked nose, my uneven teeth, the birthmark that covered half my cheek like spilled wine. But what they didn't know was that the man who would change everything couldn't see any of it. Chen had grown up believing she was the mistake nature made when it ran out of beauty. In a world obsessed with perfection, she was the glitch in the system. 23 years of cruel comments, sideways glances, and doors that closed before she could even knock had taught her one thing: some people were meant to be invisible. Then she met Alexander Blackwood, heir to $1 billion empire, a man who lived in perpetual darkness but somehow saw more than anyone with perfect sight. What happened next would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, worth, and the power of being truly seen for who you are. But first, she had to survive the cruelest rejection of her life, one that would lead her to a mansion where nothing was as it seemed, and where her journey from outcast to beloved would begin in the most unexpected way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya's hands trembled as she stood outside the glass doors of Chen and Associates Marketing, watching her reflection warp in the curved surface. Even distorted, she could see what everyone else saw: the jagged scar running from her left temple to her jaw, the result of a childhood accident that had left her face permanently asymmetrical. Her mother had always said it gave her character. Her classmates had called it grotesque. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across downtown Portland, and Maya pulled her oversized cardigan tighter around her thin frame. She'd worn her best outfit today, a navy blue dress she'd found at a thrift store, carefully mended and pressed until it looked almost professional. Today was the day she'd finally get the promotion she'd been working toward for 3 years. Inside, the building, the familiar hum of office life buzzed around her. Maya kept her head down as she walked to her cubicle, a corner space tucked away where she could work without drawing attention. She'd requested this spot specifically, close enough to be productive, far enough to avoid the daily reminders of how different she was from her polished co-workers. "Maya!" The sharp voice of her supervisor, Jennifer Walsh, cut through the ambient noise. "Conference room now!" Maya's stomach lurched. The promotion meeting wasn't scheduled for another hour. She gathered her portfolio, the presentation she'd spent weeks perfecting, and walked toward the glass-walled conference room where her future waited. Jennifer sat at the head of the polished oak table, her platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect bob, her makeup flawless under the fluorescent lights. Beside her sat Marcus Rivera, the company's creative director, and Sarah Kim, head of human resources. Maya had expected this to be a private conversation, not a tribunal. "Please, sit," Jennifer said, gesturing to the chair across from them. Maya noticed they'd positioned her so the light hit the damaged side of her face directly. "I understand you're expecting news about the senior account manager position," Jennifer began, her tone carefully neutral. Maya straightened in her chair. "Yes, I believe my performance over the past 3 years speaks for itself. I've exceeded every target, brought in 12 new clients, and we appreciate your dedication," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that made Maya's skin crawl. "However, we've decided to go in a different direction." The words hit her like a physical blow. Maya blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Maya, you're incredibly talented at what you do. Your work is exceptional, but this position requires significant client-facing responsibilities." The subtext hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. "Are you saying I can't handle client interactions?" "We're saying," Jennifer's voice grew harder, "that first impressions matter in this business. Our clients expect a certain presentation standard." Maya's hands clenched in her lap. 3 years of working twice as hard as everyone else, of staying late while her prettier co-workers left for happy hours, of proving herself over and over again, and it all came down to this. Her face wasn't good enough for success. The position has been offered to Amanda Mills, Marcus added, referencing the newest hire. A stunning brunette fresh out of college, with half Maya's experience, but twice her conventional attractiveness. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Maya stared at the 3 people who had just reduced her entire professional worth to her appearance. She thought about arguing, about mentioning the discrimination laws she'd memorized. In moments of desperation, but what was the point? They'd never say it directly. It would always be about cultural fit or client expectations or any number of corporate euphemisms for "you're too ugly to represent our company." "I see," Maya said quietly, standing up. Her portfolio fell to the floor, scattering 3 years' worth of achievements across the conference room carpet. She didn't bend to pick it up. "Maya, we hope you'll continue to be a valuable member of our team," Sarah called after her, but Maya was already walking away. She made it to the bathroom before the tears came. Locking herself in the far stall, she let out a sob that had been building for months, maybe years. She pulled out her phone and did what she'd done 100 times before. Opened a job search app and started scrolling through positions she'd never get because they all required being customer-facing or having strong interpersonal skills. Code words she'd learned to recognize. That's when she saw it. A listing that made her stop scrolling. Personal assistant needed for private estate. Discretion required. No public appearances necessary. Competitive salary. Contact Mrs. Elena Vasquez for details. The salary listed was 3 times what she was making. Maya stared at the posting, her heart pounding. No public appearances necessary. She'd never seen a job listing phrase it quite like that before. Her finger hovered over the contact button. What did she have to lose? Her current job had just made it clear she'd never advance. Her apartment rent was due in 2 weeks and her savings account was embarrassingly low. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pressed the button and typed quickly before she could second-guess herself. "Dear Mrs. Vasquez, I am interested in the personal assistant position. I have 3 years of professional experience and am available for immediate employment. I can provide references upon request. Thank you for your consideration, Maya Chen." She hit send before she could edit or overthink it. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. "Miss Chen, thank you for your inquiry. Are you available for an interview tomorrow at 2 p.m? The position is at the Blackwood estate, outside the city. Please bring identification and be prepared for a trial period if selected. Address attached. Mrs. E. Vasquez." Maya stared at the message. The Blackwood estate. Even she had heard of the Blackwood family. Old money, tech investments, philanthropic endeavors that made headlines. What could they possibly want with someone like her? She typed back, "Yes, I am available. Thank you for the opportunity." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maya submitted her resignation letter, cleaned out her desk while her former co-workers whispered among themselves, and left the building that had housed her hopes and crushed them in equal measure. That evening, in her cramped studio apartment, Maya researched everything she could find about the Blackwood family. Articles about business acquisitions, charity galas, society pages featuring elegant people in expensive clothes. And then she found the more recent articles, the ones from 2 years ago. Blackwood heir loses sight in tragic accident. Alexander Blackwood withdraws from public life following incident. Blackwood estate becomes reclusive following son's injury. Maya read about the car accident that had taken Alexander Blackwood's sight and killed his fiancée. She saw photos from before. A devastatingly handsome man with dark hair and intense eyes, always surrounded by beautiful people at exclusive events. And then nothing. No photos, no public appearances, no mention of him anywhere after the accident. She closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the black screen. Tomorrow, she would meet a man who couldn't see her face. For the first time in her life, her appearance wouldn't be the first thing someone judged about her. The irony wasn't lost on her. The world had taught her she was too ugly to matter. But perhaps the only person who might see her worth was someone who couldn't see at all. Maya fell asleep that night with a mixture of terror and hope coursing through her veins. She didn't know that tomorrow would be the first day of a journey that would challenge everything she believed about herself, about love, and about the true meaning of being seen. The rejection that had broken her heart was about to become the catalyst for the greatest transformation of her life. But first, she had to walk through the gates of the Blackwood estate and into a world where nothing would ever be the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wrought iron gates of the Blackwood estate stretched 12 feet high, adorned with intricate metalwork that spoke of old-world craftsmanship and unlimited resources. Maya sat in her aging Honda Civic, engine still running, staring through the windshield at what looked more like a fortress than a home. Beyond the gates, a winding driveway disappeared into a grove of ancient oak trees, offering only glimpses of the mansion that lay hidden within. She checked her watch, 1:47 p.m., early but not inappropriately so. Maya had spent the morning in a state of controlled panic, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a simple black blazer and grey slacks. Professional, but not trying too hard. She'd attempted to cover her facial scar with makeup, then wiped it off, then reapplied it. Nothing seemed to work. The mark remained stubbornly visible, a permanent reminder of her perceived inadequacy. Taking a deep breath, Maya pressed the intercom button beside the gate. "Maya Chen for Mrs. Vasquez," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course, Miss Chen. Please drive up to the main house. Mrs. Vasquez will meet you at the front entrance." The gates swung open with silent precision, and Maya drove through them feeling like she was crossing into another world. The driveway curved through manicured grounds that belonged in a magazine, perfectly trimmed hedges, flower beds that looked like paintings, and a fountain that could have graced a European palace. The wealth on display was understated but unmistakable, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it had been there for generations. The mansion finally came into view, and Maya's breath caught. It was a sprawling Tudor revival, all stone and timber with tall windows that reflected the afternoon sky. Ivy climbed the walls in carefully controlled patterns, and the entire structure seemed to emerge from the landscape as if it had grown there naturally over centuries. Maya parked in the circular drive, her modest car looking absurdly out of place, next to the perfectly maintained grounds. As she stepped out, the heavy oak front door opened, and a woman in her 50s approached with measured steps. Elena Vasquez was exactly what Maya had expected, and nothing like she'd imagined simultaneously. Dressed in an elegant charcoal suit with her graying hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that came from managing significant responsibility. But her eyes were kind, and when she smiled, it reached them completely. "Miss Chen, welcome to Blackwood Estate," Mrs. Vasquez said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "I trust you found the drive pleasant?" "Yes, thank you. Your grounds are beautiful," Maya replied, falling into step beside the older woman as they walked toward the house. Mr. Blackwood's grandfather designed most of the landscaping himself. He believed a man's home should reflect his character, strong foundation, natural beauty, built to last. Mrs. Vasquez paused at the front door, her hand on the ornate brass handle. "Before we go inside, I should explain a few things about the position and the household." Maya nodded, her stomach tightening with anticipation. Mr. Alexander Blackwood is a very private man. Since his accident 2 years ago, he has withdrawn almost completely from public life. He runs his business operations from here, but he sees very few people outside of essential staff. Mrs. Vasquez's tone became more serious. He can be challenging, brilliant but demanding. He has very little patience for incompetence or dishonesty. I understand, Maya said, though she wasn't sure she understood anything yet. The position involves managing his correspondence, coordinating with his business associates, maintaining his schedule, and handling various personal matters. You would live on the estate. There's a comfortable suite in the East Wing, and you would be on call essentially 24 hours a day. In exchange, the compensation is substantial, and your room and board are provided. Maya's mind raced. Live here? She'd never considered that possibility, but it made sense. If Alexander Blackwood was as reclusive as Mrs. Vasquez suggested, he would need someone available at all hours. The most important thing, Mrs. Vasquez continued, her voice dropping slightly, is discretion. What happens in this house, what you see, what you hear, it stays here. Mr. Blackwood values his privacy above almost everything else. They entered the house, and Maya had to fight to keep her expression neutral. The foyer alone was larger than her entire apartment, with marble floors that gleamed like mirrors and a chandelier that cast rainbow patterns across the walls. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister polished to perfection. "This way," Mrs. Vasquez said, leading Maya down a hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and landscapes that probably cost more than Maya made in a year. They stopped outside a door made of dark wood, carved with intricate designs. Mrs. Vasquez knocked twice, waited for a response Maya couldn't hear, then opened the door. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Chen is here for the interview. Send her in." The voice that responded was deep, cultured, with an edge that suggested its owner wasn't accustomed to being kept waiting. Maya stepped into the room, and Mrs. Vasquez closed the door behind her, leaving her alone with Alexander Blackwood for the first time. The study was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, and windows that offered a view of the estate's gardens. But Maya's attention was immediately drawn to the man seated behind the desk. Alexander Blackwood was still devastatingly handsome, even more so than in the old photographs she'd seen online. His dark hair was slightly longer now, swept back from a face that could have been sculpted by Michelangelo. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and full lips that were currently set in a neutral expression. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Pale grey, almost silver, and completely unseeing. They were fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder, beautiful and haunting in their emptiness. He was wearing a simple white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms, and his posture was perfect despite his inability to see. Everything about him radiated control, from the precise way his hands were positioned on the desk to the measured cadence of his breathing. "Sit," he said, and Maya realized she'd been standing there staring for too long. She moved to the chair across from his desk, the leather creaking softly as she settled into it. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Chen." Maya had prepared for this question, but sitting across from him, she found her rehearsed answers inadequate. "I'm 23 years old. I have a degree in business administration from Portland State University. For the past 3 years, I've worked at Chen & Associates marketing firm where I—" "Why did you leave?" The question cut through her prepared speech like a knife. Maya hesitated. She could lie, create some story about seeking new opportunities, but something in his tone suggested he would see through any deception. "I was passed over for a promotion because of my appearance," she said quietly. Alexander's expression didn't change, but she saw his fingers tighten slightly against the desk. "Explain." They said I didn't meet their presentation standards for client-facing roles. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. I have a facial scar from a childhood accident. It makes people uncomfortable. And you believe that's why you weren't promoted? I know that's why. Maya's voice grew stronger. I had the best performance record in the department. I brought in more new clients than anyone else, but I don't look like what they think success should look like. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his unseeing gaze still fixed somewhere behind her. I can't see your scar, Miss Chen, he said finally. I can't see your face at all. What I can hear is your voice, and what I hear is intelligence, determination, and honesty. Those are qualities I value far more than conventional beauty. Maya's breath caught. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. However, Alexander continued, his tone becoming more businesslike, I should warn you that working for me is not easy. I have high standards, and I don't tolerate mistakes. I can be demanding, impatient, and according to my previous assistants, insufferable when things don't go according to plan. How many previous assistants have you had? A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. 7 in the past 2 years. The longest one lasted 4 months. Maya felt a chill. 7 assistants in 2 years. What exactly was she walking into? Why did they leave? Various reasons. Some couldn't handle the isolation. Living on the estate means very little contact with the outside world. Others found my particular requirements too challenging. One left because she said I was emotionally unavailable and unnecessarily harsh. He said the last part with what might have been amusement. She wasn't wrong. Maya studied his face, trying to read the man behind the controlled exterior. What would my daily responsibilities include? Managing my correspondence with business partners, scheduling meetings via video conference, handling personal matters that require interaction with the outside world, reading documents aloud when needed, and ensuring that my privacy is maintained. At all times, he paused. You would also need to be available for travel when business requires it, though that's rare these days. And in return, $75,000 per year, plus room and board, health insurance, and complete discretion regarding your personal time when you're not needed. Alexander's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he wasn't offering more money than Maya had ever dreamed of making. Maya's mind reeled. $75,000. No rent, no utilities, no grocery bills. It was more financial security than she'd ever had in her life. There is one more thing, Alexander said, his voice dropping slightly. I need to know that you can handle the reality of working with someone who is blind. Not everyone can. Some people become uncomfortable, overly helpful, or treat me like I'm fragile. I am not fragile, Miss Chen. I am simply blind. I understand, Maya said, and she meant it. She'd spent her entire life being treated differently because of her appearance. She knew what it felt like to have people make assumptions about your capabilities based on something you couldn't control. Do you have any questions for me? Maya had dozens of questions, but one rose above the others. Why me? You could have anyone for this position. Alexander was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been throughout the entire interview. Because, Miss Chen, I have learned that the most valuable people are often the ones the world has overlooked. You've been underestimated your entire life because of your appearance. I've been underestimated since my accident because of my disability. Perhaps we understand each other better than most. Maya felt something shift in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Mrs. Vasquez will show you to your quarters, Alexander continued, his tone returning to its professional cadence. You can start tomorrow if you're interested. Consider tonight a trial period for both of us. I accept, Maya said without hesitation. For the first time since she'd entered the room, Alexander smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Welcome to Blackwood Estate, Miss Chen. I have a feeling this is going to be very interesting." As Maya left the study, she realized that for the first time in her life, someone had hired her not despite her appearance, but because they couldn't see it at all. The irony was perfect and terrifying, and exactly what she needed. She had no idea that accepting this position would change not just her life, but her understanding of what it meant to be truly seen by another person. Maya's suite in the East Wing was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. The sitting room featured plush, burgundy furniture arranged around a fireplace that looked like it had been warming the room for centuries. French doors opened onto a private terrace overlooking the estate's rose garden, and the bedroom contained a four-poster bed that could have accommodated a small family. The bathroom alone was bigger than her old studio's kitchen. She set her single suitcase on the velvet ottoman at the foot of the bed, feeling ridiculous. All her worldly possessions fit into one piece of luggage, while the walk-in closet could have housed a small boutique. The disparity between her old life and this new one was so vast it felt surreal. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Vasquez entered carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the same composed expression Maya was beginning to recognize as her default setting. "I thought you might appreciate an overview of Mr. Blackwood's routines and preferences," Mrs. Vasquez said, settling into one of the sitting room chairs and gesturing for Maya to join her. "The more you understand about how he operates, the smoother your transition will be." Maya sat across from her, grateful for any guidance that might help her avoid becoming assistant number 8. "Mr. Blackwood rises at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. He exercises in the private gym on the second floor until 6:45, then showers and has a breakfast in his study while reviewing the previous day's business reports." Mrs. Vasquez opened the portfolio, revealing pages of typed notes. "He prefers his coffee black, no sugar. Toast with butter, never jam. Fresh fruit, but nothing too sweet. Apples, pears, berries are fine, never citrus." Maya nodded, making mental notes about his specific preferences. "His morning schedule is sacred. He handles East Coast business calls from 8 to 11, then West Coast from 11 to 2. He takes lunch alone, unless there's a specific reason to dine with staff. Afternoons are reserved for correspondence, document review, and strategic planning." "What about evenings?" "That varies. Sometimes he works late. Sometimes he reads. He has extensive collections of audiobooks and braille texts. Occasionally he plays piano. The music room is on the first floor, though you'll hear it throughout the house when he plays." Mrs. Vasquez's expression softened slightly. "He's quite gifted, though he doesn't play as often as he used to, before the accident." "Yes, there was a time when the house was filled with music every evening. Now—" She trailed off, then straightened. "That's not your concern. Your job is to manage his professional life, not his personal recovery." Maya sensed there was more to the story, but Mrs. Vasquez's tone made it clear the subject was closed. "He can be demanding," Mrs. Vasquez continued, "but he's never unreasonable. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it immediately and tell him how you plan to fix it. He respects competence and honesty above all else. What he cannot tolerate is deception or excuses." They spent the next hour reviewing Alexander's contacts, his business holdings, and the complex web of investments and partnerships that comprised the Blackwood empire. Maya's head spun with the scope of it all. Tech, companies, real estate developments, venture capital funds, and charitable foundations. Alexander might be physically isolated, but his influence reached across multiple industries. "Your first day officially begins tomorrow at 7:30, Mrs. Vasquez said, closing the portfolio. "I suggest you get a good night's sleep. Mr. Blackwood tends to test new assistants rather thoroughly in their first week." That evening, Maya unpacked her belongings, which took all of 20 minutes. She stood on her terrace as the sun set over the estate, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, just the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the distant splash of the fountain. For the first time in years, Maya felt something approaching peace. No one was staring at her scar. No one was making assumptions about her worth based on her appearance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was simply a woman in a beautiful place with a chance to prove herself. She was wrong about the peace lasting. At exactly 7:30 the next morning, Maya knocked on Alexander's study door, portfolio in hand and nerves carefully controlled. Enter. He was already seated at his desk, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, despite having no meetings scheduled. A cup of coffee sat at his right hand, still steaming, and documents were spread across the desk in what appeared to be a random pattern, but which Maya suspected was actually a very specific organizational system. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. Sit. We have significant work to cover today." His tone was crisp, all business. Gone was any hint of the warmth she'd glimpsed during her interview. "I need you to review the Morrison acquisition documents and provide a summary of the environmental impact assessments. There are concerns about liability issues that need to be addressed before the board meeting next week." Maya blinked. She'd expected to start with basic administrative tasks, not dive into complex business analysis. "Of course. Where would I find those documents?" "They were emailed to you at 4:30 this morning." Maya felt her stomach drop. She hadn't checked her email yet. "I'll review them immediately and have a summary ready." "By noon," Alexander finished. "I also need you to reschedule my 2 o'clock call with Chen Industries. Move it to Thursday at the same time. The Peterson contract needs to be couriered to our legal team in Seattle today, and I need you to coordinate a video conference with our London office for Friday morning, which means dealing with the time difference calculations." He rattled off 6 more tasks in rapid succession, each one more complex than Maya had expected. This wasn't filing and answering phones. This was high-level business management that required skills she wasn't sure she possessed. "Questions?" Alexander asked when he finished. Maya's mind raced. She could admit she was overwhelmed, but that would probably end her employment before it truly began. Instead, she made rapid notes and prioritized the tasks in order of urgency. "No. Questions. I'll get started immediately." "Excellent. I'll expect regular updates throughout the day." Maya retreated to the smaller office adjacent to Alexander's study that had been prepared for her use. The computer was already logged in, the email system configured, and a phone list of important contacts posted on the bulletin board. Someone, probably Mrs. Vasquez, had thought of everything. She opened her email and nearly choked. 47 messages had arrived since yesterday evening, including the Morrison acquisition documents, a bundle of files that would have taken her hours to read under normal circumstances. She had until noon to analyze environmental impact assessments for a multi-million-dollar deal. Maya took a deep breath and dove in. The morning flew by in a blur of contracts, phone calls, and increasingly complex business terminology. The Morrison acquisition involved purchasing a manufacturing company with facilities in 3 states, and the environmental assessments raised red flags about potential groundwater contamination that could cost millions to remediate. By 11:30, Maya had managed to reschedule the Chen Industries call, arrange the courier pickup, and coordinate with London for Friday's conference. But the Morrison summary was proving more challenging than she'd anticipated. The technical language was dense, and the implications of the environmental issues were far beyond her expertise. At noon exactly, Alexander's voice came through the intercom. "Miss Chen, please bring me the Morrison summary." Maya's heart sank. She had a summary, but it was incomplete and probably inadequate. She gathered her notes and knocked on his door. "I've reviewed the documents," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk. The environmental assessments identify three primary concerns: potential groundwater contamination at the Ohio facility, soil issues at the Texas location, and air quality violations in California that are currently under EPA review. Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. Financial implications. Conservative estimates suggest remediation costs between $12 and $30 million, depending on the extent of contamination and regulatory requirements. However, I should note that I don't have enough background in environmental law to fully assess the legal liability risks. She held her breath, waiting for his response. Any reasonable boss would understand that she couldn't become an expert in environmental law overnight. But she was learning that Alexander Blackwood wasn't. Any reasonable boss. "Honest assessment," he said finally. "What's your recommendation?" Maya straightened. "Request additional environmental studies before proceeding. The potential cost savings from the acquisition don't justify the liability risks if the contamination is worse than initially assessed." Alexander leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Maya wondered if she'd just talked herself out of a job by recommending against a deal he clearly wanted to pursue. "Agreed," he said. "Draft a memo to the board outlining those concerns and recommending we delay the acquisition pending additional environmental due diligence." Maya blinked in surprise. "You agree?" "Miss Chen, I didn't hire you to tell me what you think I want to hear. I hired you to think critically and provide honest assessments. Anyone can read documents and summarize them. I need someone who can analyze information and make sound recommendations, even when it means contradicting your plans, especially then." Alexander's voice carried a hint of amusement. "If I wanted a yes person, I would have hired one of the dozens of candidates who spent their interviews telling me how wonderful I am." Maya felt a surge of confidence. "In that case, I think your afternoon schedule is too packed. You have 7 calls scheduled between 1 and 5 o'clock with no breaks. That's not sustainable." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Are you managing my schedule now? I'm suggesting that fatigue leads to poor decision-making, and poor decisions cost money. What do you propose?" "Move 3 of the calls to tomorrow, block out 30 minutes for lunch, and create 15-minute buffers between calls to allow for preparation and note-taking." Alexander was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the interview. "Do it," he said. "And Miss Chen?" "Yes?" "Good work on the Morrison analysis. You may not be an environmental lawyer, but you think like a businesswoman. That's exactly what I need." As Maya left his office to rearrange his schedule, she realized something fundamental had shifted. Alexander wasn't just testing her competence, he was teaching her to think beyond her limitations. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she felt like she might actually succeed in this position. She had no idea that success would bring its own complications, or that learning to work with Alexander Blackwood was just the beginning of understanding him as a man. 3 weeks into her employment at Blackwood Estate, Maya had developed a rhythm that felt almost natural. She woke at 5:15, 15 minutes before Alexander, and used those precious moments to review the day's priorities while drinking coffee in her sitting room. By the time she knocked on his study door at 7:30, she was prepared for whatever challenges he might throw at her, and Alexander Blackwood always had challenges. "The Riverside project needs a complete financial restructuring," he announced on a particularly grey Thursday morning, barely looking up from the braille. Documents spread across his desk. "The construction costs have exceeded projections by 40%. And the investors are threatening to pull out." Maya set down her coffee and opened her tablet. The Riverside project was a mixed-use development in downtown Portland, residential. Units, commercial space and community facilities designed to revitalize an underused area. She'd been following the project peripherally, but hadn't realized it was in trouble. "What's causing the overruns?" she asked, pulling up the project files. "Labor disputes, supply chain issues, and what our site manager diplomatically calls unforeseen complications with the foundation work." Alexander's tone suggested he had less diplomatic words for the situation. "I need you to analyze the numbers and present options. We can restructure the financing, find additional investors, or cut our losses and sell to a competitor." "When do you need the analysis?" "End of day. I have a conference call with the investment group tomorrow morning." Maya nodded, already mentally reorganizing her schedule. This was becoming a pattern. Alexander would present her with complex problems that required immediate attention, then trust her to find solutions. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "There's something else," Alexander continued, his voice taking on a more careful tone. "I need you to attend a site meeting this afternoon." Maya looked up from her tablet. "A site meeting. The contractors, the architect, and the city planning representative will all be there. I would normally handle it myself, but—" He gestured vaguely toward his eyes. "Construction sites aren't ideal for someone who can't see. I need you to be my eyes and ears." The request caught Maya off guard. In 3 weeks, she hadn't left the estate except for quick trips to town for supplies. The idea of representing Alexander in person, with people who didn't know about her scar, made her stomach clench. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to—" "You're more qualified than anyone else I have available," Alexander interrupted. "You understand the financial implications better than anyone, and you ask the right questions. That's what I need." Maya took a slow breath. "What exactly would you want me to do?" "Listen, observe. Ask about the specific causes of the delays and cost overruns. Get a sense of whether the site manager is competent or if we need to make changes. Take photos if possible. I'll have Mrs. Vasquez arrange for you to have access. To my photographer if needed." The casual way he mentioned needing photos because he couldn't see them himself made Maya's chest tighten. She was learning that Alexander rarely acknowledged his blindness directly, but it appeared in these small, matter-of-fact statements that revealed how much he had to depend on others. "I'll do it," she said before she could second-guess herself. Alexander nodded approvingly. "The meeting is at 2:00. Dress professionally but practically. Construction sites require hard hats and safety gear. Mrs. Vasquez will provide everything you need." 4 hours later, Maya stood at the entrance to the Riverside Project construction site, wearing a yellow hard hat that felt too large and safety boots that pinched her feet. The site manager, a weathered man named Tony Castellanos, approached, with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "You're from Blackwood?" he asked, his gaze flickering across her face and lingering on her scar before moving away. Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but forced herself to maintain professional composure. "Maya Chen, Mr. Blackwood's assistant. He sent me to assess the current situation." Tony shrugged. "Not much to assess. We're behind schedule, over budget, and dealing with problems nobody could have predicted. Your boss isn't the only one who's frustrated." As they walked through the site, Maya began to understand the scope of the challenges. The foundation work had revealed underground utility lines that weren't on any city plans, requiring expensive rerouting. A labor dispute with the electrical contractors had delayed work for 2 weeks, and recent rains had revealed drainage issues that needed immediate attention. But as Tony explained each problem, Maya noticed something else. His explanations were vague, his timelines inconsistent, and when she asked specific questions about costs, he became evasive. "The electrical work delay," Maya said, consulting her notes as they stopped near the partially completed first floor. "You mentioned it lasted 2 weeks. Can you walk me through what happened?" Tony's jaw tightened. "Union issues, nothing we could control." What kind of union issues specifically? Look, lady, I don't know what your boss told you, but these things happen in construction. You can't predict every problem. Maya studied his face, noting the defensive tone and the way he avoided eye contact. I'm not questioning the existence of problems, Mr. Castellanos. I'm trying to understand them so Mr. Blackwood can make informed decisions about how to proceed. Maybe your boss should come see for himself instead of sending... Tony trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. Instead of sending what? Maya asked quietly. Tony's face reddened. Look, no offense, but what does someone like you know about construction? Someone like you. Maya had heard variations of that phrase her entire life, but the sting never lessened. Usually, it referred to her appearance. Today, it seemed to encompass everything Tony found lacking about her. Her gender, her inexperience, possibly her race. You're right, Maya said calmly. I don't know much about construction, but I know a lot about numbers, and the numbers on this project don't add up. She pulled out her tablet and began reading from the financial report she'd reviewed that morning. According to your invoices, the electrical delay cost $60,000 in overtime to make up lost time. But if the work was stopped for 2 weeks due to union issues, why was there overtime? Tony's expression shifted from dismissive to wary. Equipment had to be moved, crews had to be reassigned. The overtime invoices are dated during the supposed work stoppage. Maya continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Either the delay didn't happen the way you described, or there are billing irregularities that need to be addressed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sounds of construction equipment from other parts of the site. Maya waited, having learned from watching Alexander that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was let someone else fill the silence. There were complications, Tony finally said. The union thing got resolved faster than expected, but we had to work overtime to catch up. Then why does your progress report from 3 weeks ago show the electrical work as completed on schedule? Tony's face went pale. Maya realized she'd stumbled onto something bigger than simple cost overruns. The inconsistencies in his reports weren't the result of poor project management. They were deliberate. I think I need to see your complete records, Maya said carefully. All invoices, progress reports, and change orders since the project began. Now wait just a minute. Mr. Castellanos, Mr. Blackwood has invested over $8 million in this project. He has a right to understand exactly where that money has gone. Maya spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents, taking photographs, and asking increasingly pointed questions. By the time she left the site, she had a clear picture of what was happening, and it wasn't just construction delays. Back at the estate, Alexander was waiting in his study, the afternoon light casting shadows across his desk. Maya knocked and entered, her mind still processing everything she'd discovered. How did it go? Alexander asked, without looking up from his braille reader. Maya sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. I think Tony Castellanos is stealing from you. Alexander's head lifted sharply. Explain. Maya walked him through her findings, the inconsistent timelines, the duplicate billing, the progress reports that didn't match the actual work completed. As she spoke, Alexander's expression grew progressively darker. How much are we talking about? He asked when she finished. Conservatively, at least $200,000 in fraudulent charges, possibly more. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Evidence? Photographic documentation of the work completed versus what was billed. Copies of invoices that show clear patterns of overbilling. Testimony from workers on site who contradicted his timeline of events. Good work. Alexander's voice was calm, but Maya could hear the anger beneath it. I'll have our legal team review everything tomorrow. I'm sorry, Maya said quietly. For what? For not catching this sooner. The signs were probably there in the financial reports. Miss Chen. Alexander's voice cut through her self-recrimination. You identified a problem that our accountants, our lawyers, and our project managers all missed. You did exactly what I needed you to do." Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with professional pride. "What happens now? Now we decide whether to prosecute or simply fire him and demand restitution. That's a decision for tomorrow." Alexander stood up, moving to the window with the confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of his space. "Today, you proved something important." "What's that?" Alexander turned toward her, his unseeing gaze somehow finding her face with uncanny accuracy. "That you're not just my assistant, Miss Chen. You're my partner in protecting what we've built. Here." The word partner hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Maya wasn't ready to examine. She had come to Blackwood Estate looking for a job. She was beginning to realize she might have found something much more significant. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, his voice softer now. "How did Castellanos treat you today?" Maya hesitated. She could downplay the interactions, pretend that Tony's dismissiveness hadn't bothered her, but Alexander had been honest with her from the beginning. She owed him the same courtesy. "He made assumptions about my competence based on my appearance," she said simply. "It's nothing I haven't handled before." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And despite that, you did your job professionally and thoroughly." "Yes. That's why you're here, Miss Chen, because you're strong enough to handle people who underestimate you and smart enough to prove them wrong." As Maya left his study that evening, she realized something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were allies in a world that had taught them both what it meant to be underestimated. She had no idea that alliance was about to become something much deeper, or that the man who couldn't see her face was beginning to see parts of her that no one else ever had. The thunderstorm hit Blackwood Estate at 3 in the morning with the fury of nature unleashed. Maya jolted awake as lightning illuminated her bedroom in stark white flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. Rain lashed against her windows with such intensity that she wondered if the glass might shatter. She'd always been nervous during storms, a childhood fear that had never fully left her. But this was different. This was the kind of storm that made even the massive estate feel fragile against nature's power. When the lights flickered and then died completely, Maya's anxiety spiked. She fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight. To navigate to the emergency candles Mrs. Vasquez had shown her in the sitting room. The backup generator should have kicked in by now, but the house remained dark and eerily quiet, except for the storm's rage outside. A sharp crack echoed through the night, the unmistakable sound of a tree falling. Maya moved to her terrace doors and peered out into the darkness. She couldn't see much, but the sound had come from the direction of the main house, near Alexander's wing. Her first instinct was to check if he was all right, but she hesitated. It was 3 in the morning, and despite their growing professional partnership, they maintained strict boundaries about personal space and privacy. But then another crash echoed through the storm, closer this time, and Maya's concern overrode her hesitation. She grabbed a robe over her pajamas, took one of the emergency flashlights, and made her way through the darkened corridors toward Alexander's study. The mansion felt different in the darkness, larger, more maze-like, filled with shadows that seemed to move in her flashlight beam. When she reached Alexander's study, she found the door open and the room empty. Her pulse quickened. Where would he be during a power outage? She remembered Mrs. Vasquez mentioning that Alexander sometimes worked late into the night, but his usual spaces were all empty. Then she heard it, piano music, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Maya followed the sound through corridors she'd never explored, past family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her flashlight beam. The music grew stronger as she approached what she realized must Be the music room Mrs. Vasquez had mentioned. When she reached the doorway, she stopped, transfixed by what she saw. Alexander sat at a grand piano in the center of the room, his fingers moving across the keys with fluid precision despite the complete darkness. Candles flickered around the room. He must have lit them when the power failed, casting dancing shadows across his face and highlighting the intense concentration in his expression. The piece he was playing was hauntingly beautiful, melancholy, and complex, with cascading runs that seemed to mirror the storm outside. Maya had never heard anything like it, and she realized with a start that he was improvising, creating the music as the storm inspired him. She stood transfixed in the doorway, afraid to move and break the spell. This was Alexander, as she'd never seen him. Not the controlled businessman or the demanding employer, but an artist lost in creation, vulnerable and completely unguarded. The music shifted, becoming more tempestuous, matching the thunder outside. His whole body moved with the rhythm, and Maya could see the passion that he kept so carefully hidden in his professional life. For the first time since meeting him, she glimpsed the man he had been before the accident, creative, expressive, unafraid to feel deeply. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Maya jump, and her flashlight clinked against the doorframe. The music stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" Alexander's voice was sharp, all the vulnerability instantly replaced by wariness. "It's Maya," she said quickly, stepping into the candlelight. "I'm sorry. I heard the tree fall and wanted to make sure you were all right when the power went out." Alexander's hand stilled on the keys, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I'm fine. You shouldn't be wandering the house at night." "I was worried," Maya said simply, then added, "That was beautiful. The music." Something flickered in Alexander's expression, surprise perhaps, or discomfort at being observed in such an unguarded moment. "It helps me think. Do you compose often?" "Not anymore." His voice carried a finality that suggested the subject was closed, but Maya found herself unable to let it go. "Why not? You're incredibly talented." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because composition requires inspiration, Miss Chen, and inspiration requires the ability to see beauty in the world." The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered, and Maya felt her heart clench. "You don't need to see beauty to create it," she said softly. "What you just played was more beautiful than anything I've ever heard." Alexander turned toward her sharply, as if her words had struck him physically. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Maya interrupted, her own voice growing stronger. "I've spent my entire life being told I'm not beautiful enough to matter, but you've taught me that worth isn't about what people see when they look at you." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the flash of lightning that followed, Maya saw something shift in Alexander's expression. The careful control he maintained was cracking, revealing the grief and anger he'd kept buried since the accident. "It's not the same," he said quietly. "Isn't it? You lost your sight. I never had conventional beauty. We've both learned to navigate a world that judges us by things we can't control." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently picking out a simple melody on the keys. "Before the accident, I could see everything," he said finally. "Colors, light, the way shadows fell across a room. I could see Elena's face when she laughed, the way her eyes lit up when she was excited about something. I could see the sunset from my office window, the way the city looked at night with all its lights spread out below." Elena, Maya realized, with a start, that this was the first time Alexander had mentioned his late fiancée by name. "I composed music inspired by what I saw," Alexander continued, his voice growing quieter. "Visual beauty translated into sound. Now there's only darkness, and the music that comes from darkness is profound," Maya finished when he trailed off. "The piece you just played came from darkness, and it was the most moving thing I've ever experienced. Alexander's hands stilled on the keys. "You really think so?" "I know so." Maya moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. "Music doesn't have to come from visual beauty, Alexander. It can come from emotional truth, from experiences that go deeper than what the eyes can see." She realized she'd used his first name without thinking, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he seemed to be considering her words with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "Play something else," Maya said impulsively. "Please." Alexander hesitated, then placed his hands on the keys again. This time, the music that emerged was different, softer, more hopeful, with themes that seemed to interweave and build on each other like a conversation between old friends. Maya found herself moving closer without conscious thought, drawn by the intimacy of the moment. The storm outside seemed to fade as the music filled the space between them, creating a cocoon of candlelight and sound that felt separate from the rest of the world. "Sit," Alexander said quietly, nodding toward the bench beside him. Maya hesitated, only a moment before settling next to him on the piano bench. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the subtle cologne he wore, sense the controlled power in his movements as his fingers danced across the keys. "This was Elena's, her favorite piece," Alexander said as he began a new melody, one that was achingly beautiful and filled with longing. "I wrote it for our engagement party. I haven't played it since the accident. Since I realized I would never see her face again when I played it." Maya's breath caught at the raw pain in his voice. What was she like? Alexander's playing never faltered, but she saw his jaw tighten. Beautiful, brilliant. She could light up a room just by walking into it. Everyone loved her instantly. Maya felt a stab of something she didn't want to examine too closely. "You must miss her terribly." "Every day." Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper, but lately. He stopped playing abruptly, his hands falling to his lap. "Lately what?" Maya prompted gently. Alexander turned toward her, and in the candlelight she could see confusion and something else, something that looked almost like guilt in his expression. "Lately, I find myself thinking about other things, other people." His voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "I feel like I'm betraying her memory." Maya's heart began beating faster as she realized the implication of his words. "Alexander, I know it's wrong," he said quickly. "She's only been gone 2 years, and I should be mourning her, not—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was revealing more than he'd intended. "Not what?" Maya asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Alexander was quiet for so long that Maya thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "Not finding myself drawn to someone else, someone who makes me forget for just a moment what I've lost." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Maya's pulse raced as she processed his words, the implications they carried, the dangerous territory they were entering. "Grief isn't linear," she said carefully. "Healing doesn't follow a schedule." "But this isn't just healing," Alexander said, turning to face her more fully. "This is something else entirely." In the candlelight, with the storm raging outside and the intimate space of the music room surrounding them, Maya felt the careful boundaries they'd maintained beginning to crumble. The professional relationship, the employer-employee dynamic, the safe distance they'd kept, it was all dissolving in the face of this raw honesty. "Alexander," she said softly, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. He reached out then, his hand finding her face with the careful precision of someone who navigated the world through touch. His fingers traced the line of her scar, the mark that had defined how the world saw her for so long. "I can't see your face," he said quietly, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "But I can feel your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I can hear your laugh when something amuses you, the way your voice changes when you're concentrating. I know you bite your lip when you're nervous, and that you hum quietly when you think no one is listening." Maya's breath caught as she realized how closely he'd been paying attention to her, how much he'd learned about her through senses other than sight. "The world sees your scar and thinks it diminishes your beauty," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger. "But I experience your beauty in ways that have nothing to do with how you look, and it terrifies me." Maya leaned into his touch, her heart racing with possibility and fear in equal measure. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because," Alexander said, his hand still cradling her face, "I'm falling in love with you, and I don't know if that makes me a better man for moving forward or a worse one for letting go." The confession hung in the air between them, transformative and terrifying. Maya realized that everything was about to change, that they were standing at the edge of something that would alter both their lives forever. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the music room, lit by candles and filled with the echo of honest words, Maya Chen, the girl everyone had called ugly, was falling in love with a man who couldn't see her face, but somehow saw everything else about her that mattered. The morning after the storm brought an awkwardness that Maya hadn't anticipated. She woke with Alexander's confession echoing in her mind, "I'm falling in love with you," and the memory of his touch on her face, gentle and reverent in the candlelight. But as she dressed for work, reality crept in with harsh efficiency. Alexander Blackwood was one of the wealthiest men in the country. She was his employee, living in his house, dependent on his generosity for everything from her salary to the roof over her head. The power imbalance was staggering, and in the cold light of morning, Maya wondered if she'd misunderstood something fundamental about the night before. When she knocked on his study door at 7:30, Alexander's voice was carefully neutral. "Enter." He was seated at his desk, as always, immaculately dressed in a navy suit, every hair in place. If not for the faint shadows under his eyes, Maya might have wondered if the previous night had been a dream. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, testing the waters by reverting to his formal title. Something flickered across his expression, disappointment perhaps, but his voice remained professional. "Miss Chen, I trust you slept well despite the storm." "Yes, thank you." Maya settled into her usual chair, the distance between them feeling vast despite the familiar setting. "The power has been restored, and Mrs. Vasquez reports minimal damage to the grounds." "Good." Alexander opened a file on his desk with slightly too much focus. "We need to discuss the Morrison acquisition. Legal has reviewed your findings about the billing irregularities, and they're recommending we pursue criminal charges against Castellanos." For the next hour, they worked with rigid professionalism, discussing contracts and financial reports as if nothing had changed between them. But Maya could feel the tension humming beneath the surface, the careful way Alexander avoided looking in her direction, the stilted quality of their usual easy communication. By mid-morning, Maya couldn't stand it anymore. When Alexander paused to take a phone call, she retreated to her office and tried to lose herself in spreadsheets and correspondence. But her mind kept drifting to the music room, to the vulnerability in his voice when he'd spoken about Elena, to the way his fingers had traced her scar as if it were something precious rather than shameful. At 11:30, Mrs. Vasquez appeared, in her doorway, with the expression that suggested she'd noticed the unusual tension in the house. "Miss Chen, Mr. Blackwood has asked me to inform you that he'll be working through lunch today and won't require your assistance until after 2 o'clock. Maya looked up from her computer, confused. Alexander never worked through lunch, and he'd never dismissed her for extended periods without explanation. Is everything all right? Is he feeling well? Mrs. Vasquez studied her carefully. He seems preoccupied. Perhaps you might use the time to take a walk in the gardens. Fresh air often helps with difficult situations. The knowing look in the older woman's eyes suggested she understood more about the household dynamics than she let on. Maya nodded gratefully and stepped outside, desperate for space to think. The storm had left the estate looking refreshed and slightly wild. Tree branches littered the pathways, and the rose garden bore the scars of wind and rain. But there was something beautiful about the aftermath, a sense of renewal, of nature reasserting itself. Maya was examining a fallen oak tree near the fountain when she heard voices approaching. She looked up to see two women walking toward the main house, their designer clothing and confident bearing marking them as visitors from Alexander's social circle. "I still can't believe he's living like a hermit out here," one of them was saying. She was tall and blonde, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from a lifetime of privilege. "It's been 2 years, Victoria. Elena wouldn't have wanted him to disappear from the world." The other woman, a redhead with sharp features and calculating eyes, nodded in agreement. "That's exactly why we're here, Samantha. Someone needs to remind Alexander that he has responsibilities beyond wallowing in guilt." Maya froze behind the oak tree, realizing she was about to overhear a conversation she definitely shouldn't witness. But before she could retreat, the women continued speaking, and what they said next made her blood run cold. "I heard he hired some girl as a personal assistant," Victoria said with obvious disdain. "Live-in help, if you can believe it. Mrs. Vasquez was very diplomatic when I called, but between the lines, it sounds like he's become completely dependent on this woman." "How inappropriate," Samantha replied, "and potentially dangerous. You know how vulnerable men can be after traumatic experiences. This girl could be taking advantage of his isolation." Maya's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and humiliation. They were talking about her as if she were some kind of predator, as if her very presence in Alexander's life was suspect. "Elena's parents are concerned," Victoria continued. "They think Alexander needs professional help, not some live-in caretaker who might have ulterior motives. Well, that's why we're here, to assess the situation and report back to them." Samantha's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who enjoyed other people's drama. "If this assistant is overstepping her bounds, we'll make sure it's addressed." The women moved out of earshot, heading toward the front entrance. But Maya remained frozen behind the fallen tree. Elena's parents were concerned. These women were here to assess the situation. Maya realized with growing horror that she was being investigated, judged by people who saw her as a threat to Alexander's well-being. More than that, she understood now why Alexander had been so distant that morning. He wasn't having second thoughts about his feelings. He was protecting her from exactly this kind of scrutiny. Maya made her way back to the house through a side entrance, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Alexander, to understand what was happening and how serious the situation was. But as she approached his study, she could hear voices inside. Alexander's deep tones mixed with the lighter voices of his visitors. "Alexander, darling, you look wonderful," Samantha was saying with forced brightness. "We've been so worried about you hiding away out here." "I'm not hiding," Alexander replied, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm working. Some of us have businesses to run, of course, but there's work and then there's isolation," Victoria interjected. "Elena's parents are concerned that you're not processing your grief in a healthy way." Maya pressed herself against the wall outside the study, knowing she shouldn't. Listen, but unable to walk away. "My grief is my own concern," Alexander said, his tone growing colder. "But it's not, though, is it?" Samantha's voice became more pointed. "When you disappear from society completely, when you surround yourself with employees instead of friends, When you refuse to see the people who care about you, that affects everyone who loves you. I see the people I need to see, like your assistant. Victoria's voice dripped with disdain. Alexander, we understand that you need help managing things, but don't you think it's inappropriate to become so dependent on hired help? Maya's cheeks burned with humiliation. They were discussing her as if she were a servant who'd overstepped her bounds, as if her relationship with Alexander was inherently inappropriate because of their different social stations. Maya is extremely competent, Alexander said, and Maya's heart clenched at the careful neutrality in his voice. She manages my business affairs efficiently. I'm sure she does, Samantha replied with false sweetness. But Elena's parents are worried that you might be confusing professional assistance with personal connection. It's understandable, given your isolation, but potentially unhealthy. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya waited for Alexander to defend her, to tell these women that his relationships were none of their business, to assert his independence and his right to make his own choices. Instead, she heard him say quietly, "Perhaps they have a point." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from gasping, tears springing to her eyes as the implications sank in. Alexander was agreeing with them. He was acknowledging that his feelings for her might be unhealthy, inappropriate, a product of his isolation rather than genuine emotion. "We think it might be best if you had some professional help," Victoria continued gently. "A real companion, someone from your social circle who understands your world. Elena's cousin Margaret is recently divorced and would be happy to spend time with you. Or perhaps you could consider returning to some of your old activities," Samantha added. "The charity board meetings, the business dinners. People miss you, Alexander." Maya couldn't listen anymore. She turned and fled back to her room, her chest tight with humiliation and heartbreak. Everything she'd felt the night before, the connection, the intimacy, the sense that someone finally saw her true worth, had been called into question by women who viewed her as nothing more than a potential threat to their social order. Worse, Alexander wasn't defending what they'd shared. He was questioning it himself, allowing others to diminish it as the product of his trauma rather than genuine feeling. Maya spent the afternoon in her room, alternating between anger and despair. She understood now why Alexander had been distant. That morning, he was already pulling away, already allowing doubt to creep in about what had happened between them. When evening came, Maya steeled herself and knocked on Alexander's study door. She needed to know where she stood, what these visitors had convinced him to believe about their relationship. "Enter." Alexander was alone again, the visitors apparently gone. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the afternoon had aged him. "Maya." He said her name carefully, as if testing how it felt. "Please sit." Maya remained standing, her back straight and her voice controlled. "I need to know if my position here is secure." Alexander's face went very still. "What do you mean?" "I overheard some of your conversation today. Your visitors seem to think I'm taking advantage of your isolation, that my presence here is inappropriate." Maya forced herself to meet his unseeing gaze. "I need to know if you agree with them." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk in the rhythm Maya had learned to recognize as his tell when he was conflicted. "Maya," he said finally, "what happened last night?" "Was a mistake," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the pain blooming in her chest. "Was complicated," Alexander finished. "These people have known me my entire life. They knew Elena, they knew us together. Their perspective carries weight. And their perspective is that I'm overstepping my bounds as an employee." Alexander's jaw tightened. They're concerned that I might be transferring feelings inappropriately, that my isolation has created an unhealthy dependence. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. And what do you think? Alexander turned toward the window, though he couldn't see the darkening sky beyond. I think, he said slowly, that I need to be very careful not to confuse gratitude with something deeper. You've been invaluable to me professionally, Maya. I don't want to jeopardize that by misinterpreting our working relationship. The careful, clinical way he spoke made Maya's heart crack. He was retreating behind professional boundaries, allowing others to convince him that his feelings weren't real. I see, Maya said quietly. Then perhaps we should both maintain appropriate professional distance going forward. Perhaps we should, Alexander agreed, though his voice sounded strained. Maya turned to leave, then stopped at the door. For what it's worth, she said without looking back, what I felt last night wasn't gratitude or confusion. It was real. But I understand that your world and mine operate by different rules. She left before he could respond, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, Maya realized that she'd been naive to think that love could transcend the vast differences in their circumstances. Alexander Blackwood lived in a world of expectations and social obligations, surrounded by people who would never accept someone like her as anything more than hired help. And despite everything he'd said about seeing beyond appearances, he was still a product of that world. Maya had thought she'd found someone who valued her for who she truly was. Instead, she'd discovered that even the most profound connections could be destroyed by the weight of other people's judgments. The girl everyone called ugly had learned to love a man who couldn't see her face. But love, she was learning, wasn't always enough to overcome the barriers that society built between people who dared to cross the lines of class and expectation. 2 weeks passed in a state of careful professional courtesy that felt like walking on broken glass. Maya and Alexander maintained their working relationship with the precision of experienced actors, discussing business matters with perfect propriety, while the unspoken tension between them grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Maya threw herself into her work with desperate intensity, managing Alexander's increasingly complex business dealings, as if efficiency could somehow fill the void that had opened in her chest. She reorganized his filing systems, streamlined his correspondence, and took on additional responsibilities that kept her busy from dawn until well past sunset. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be accepting more meetings and calls than ever before, as if he too was using work to avoid the dangerous territory of personal interaction. When they did speak, it was about contracts and schedules, with neither of them mentioning the music room or the storm or the words that had changed everything between them. But Maya could feel him watching her, or rather, listening to her, with the heightened attention of someone whose other senses compensated for sight. She caught him turning toward her when she entered a room, noticed the way his posture changed when she spoke, saw how his hands would still on whatever task he was performing when she laughed at something in their phone conversations with clients. The careful distance they maintained was slowly driving them both mad. On a Wednesday morning in late October, Maya arrived at Alexander's study to find Mrs. Vasquez waiting with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Miss Chen," Mrs. Vasquez said, her usual composure slightly strained, "Mr. Blackwood has asked me to inform you that he'll be hosting several guests for dinner tonight, important business associates and some personal friends." Maya nodded, pulling out her tablet to take notes. "How many guests? Should I coordinate with the catering staff?" 8 guests, and yes, please coordinate with Chef Martinez about the menu preferences I've prepared." Mrs. Vasquez handed her a detailed list. "However, there's something else you should know. Mrs. Elena Whitmore will be attending." Maya's blood ran cold. Elena Whitmore, Elena's mother. Alexander's deceased fiancée's mother would be in the house tonight, undoubtedly to assess the situation that Samantha and Victoria had reported back to her. "I see," Maya managed to say evenly. "Should I prepare anything special for Mrs. Whitmore's arrival?" Mrs. Vasquez studied her carefully. "Miss Chen, Mrs. Whitmore is a formidable woman. She loved her daughter very much, and she has very specific ideas about how Alexander should be living his life." The warning was clear. Maya was being prepared for battle, even if the battlefield would be disguised as a dinner party. "I understand. Is there anything else I should know?" "Alexander has asked that you join the dinner," Mrs. Vasquez said quietly, "as his assistant to help facilitate business conversations." Maya's stomach dropped. Alexander wanted her there, in the same room as Elena's mother, performing her professional role while the woman who probably saw her as a threat evaluated her every move. It felt like being asked to audition for her own execution. That evening, Maya stood in front of her bedroom mirror, trying to decide what armor to wear to this particular battle. She'd chosen a simple black dress, professional but not dowdy, elegant but not trying too hard. She'd covered her scar with makeup, then wiped it off, then reapplied it. Nothing felt right. Finally, she left the scar visible. If Elena's mother was going to judge her, Maya decided, let her judge the real woman, not some carefully constructed facade. When she entered the dining room at 7 o'clock, the assembled guests turned to look at her with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Alexander stood near the fireplace, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, engaged in conversation with a distinguished man who was probably one of his business partners. But Maya's attention was immediately drawn to the woman seated near the head of the table. Elena Whitmore was exactly what Maya had expected, and somehow worse than she'd imagined. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of refined beauty that spoke of generations of privilege, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. When Elena's mother's eyes met Maya's, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mrs. Whitmore," Alexander said, moving toward them with the careful navigation Maya had learned to recognize. "I'd like you to meet Maya Chen, my assistant. Maya has been invaluable in managing my business affairs." Eleanor's mother stood gracefully, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Miss Chen, I've heard so much about you." Maya shook the offered hand, noting the woman's strong grip and calculating gaze. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Alexander speaks of Eleanor often and with great love." Something flickered in the older woman's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that Maya would mention her daughter so directly. Yes, well, Elena and Alexander were perfectly suited for each other. Such a tragedy that their future together was cut short. The message was clear. Elena had been perfect for Alexander in ways that Maya never could be. Dinner proceeded with the kind of careful choreography that only came from years of practice at high society gatherings. Maya found herself seated between a tech mogul and a pharmaceutical heiress, both of whom made polite conversation while clearly trying to assess what role she played in Alexander's life. Throughout the meal, Maya was hyper-aware of Elena's mother, watching her every move, noting how she interacted with Alexander, measuring the distance between them, cataloguing every glance and gesture for future analysis. The conversation flowed around topics Maya was familiar with, from Alexander's business dealings, market trends, investment opportunities, charitable initiatives. She contributed when appropriate, offering insights that demonstrated her knowledge of Alexander's work, but she could feel the undercurrent of judgment flowing beneath the polite surface. After the main course, Elena's mother turned her attention directly to Maya with the focused intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. "Miss Chen, tell us about your background. How did you come to work for Alexander?" Maya felt every eye at the table turned toward her. I have a degree in business administration from Portland State University. I worked in marketing for 3 years before joining Mr. Blackwood's team. How interesting. And your family? Are they in business as well? Maya recognized the fishing expedition for what it was, an attempt to establish her social credentials and find them lacking. My parents own a small restaurant in Portland. They immigrated from Taiwan when I was young. How industrious of them, Eleanor's mother said, with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. And you're living here at the estate now? That must be quite an adjustment from city life. The work requires availability at all hours, Maya replied carefully. Mr. Blackwood's business interests span multiple time zones. Yes, I imagine it would be difficult to maintain appropriate boundaries when living and working in such close proximity. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Maya felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her voice steady. I've found that professionalism isn't determined by geography, Mrs. Whitmore. It's a matter of character and respect. Alexander's voice cut through the sudden tension. Maya has maintained the highest professional standards throughout her employment here. Her integrity is beyond question. Elena's mother's smile became sharper. Of course, dear. I'm sure Miss Chen is very dedicated to her work. The dinner continued, but the battle lines had been drawn. Every subsequent conversation felt loaded, with subtext, every casual remark a potential trap. After dessert, the guests moved to the library for after-dinner drinks. Maya started to excuse herself. Her role as facilitator was complete, but Alexander's voice stopped her. Maya, could you stay? I may need your assistance with some of the business discussions. Eleanor's mother's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Maya nodded and found a seat near the window, close enough to be available, but far enough away to avoid the intimate circle forming around Alexander. As the evening progressed, Maya watched Elena's mother work the room with the skill of a master manipulator. She regaled the guests with stories of Elena and Alexander's courtship, painted vivid pictures of their perfect future that had been tragically cut short, and made subtle but pointed comments about the importance of honoring the past. Elena had such vision for their life together, she told the pharmaceutical heiress. They were going to renovate the east wing of the estate, turn it into a proper family area for the children they planned to have. Elena picked out the color schemes herself, soft blues and greens, so peaceful and elegant. Maya felt each word like a small wound. Elena's mother wasn't just grieving her daughter. She was actively working to keep Elena's memory alive in ways that would crowd out any possibility of Alexander moving forward. Near 10 o'clock, the guests began to take their leave. Maya stood to help coordinate the departures, but Elena's mother approached her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Miss Chen, might I have a word with you privately? Maya's pulse quickened, but she nodded. Of course. Elena's mother led her to Alexander's study, closing the door behind them with deliberate care. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the room where Maya had spent so many hours working alongside Alexander, and the contrast couldn't have been starker, the elegant society matron and the scarred girl from nowhere. I'm going to be direct, Elena's mother said, dropping all pretense of politeness. You need to leave. Maya had expected this, but the blunt delivery still took her breath away. Excuse me? Alexander is vulnerable right now. He's isolated, grieving, and susceptible to confusion about his feelings. Your presence here is preventing him from processing his grief properly and moving forward in healthy ways. That's not true, Maya said, finding her voice. Alexander is stronger than you think. He doesn't need protecting from his own choices. Elena's mother laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Choices. My dear girl, you're not a choice. You're a convenient distraction, a way for Alexander to avoid dealing with his real emotions. Do you honestly think a man like Alexander Blackwood would be interested in someone like you under normal circumstances?" The words hit their target with surgical precision. Maya felt her carefully constructed confidence begin to crumble as all her old insecurities came rushing back. "You're living in a fantasy," Elena's mother continued relentlessly. "Alexander comes from a world of privilege and expectation. He needs a partner who can move in his social circles, who understands his responsibilities, who can give him the kind of life Elena would have provided. You can't give him any of that." "Maybe those things aren't as important as you think they are," Maya managed to say. "Aren't they? Then why hasn't Alexander introduced you to any of his real friends? Why does he keep you hidden away here like a guilty secret? Why hasn't he taken you to any social events or business functions where people might see you together?" Each question was a dagger because Maya couldn't answer any of them. Alexander hadn't introduced her to his social circle. He hadn't taken her anywhere public. Even tonight, she'd been presented as his assistant, nothing more. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," Elena's mother said, her tone becoming businesslike. "Leave now, quietly, and I'll ensure you receive an excellent reference and a substantial severance package. Enough to start over anywhere you choose, with enough money to make a real life for yourself. And if I don't," Elena's mother's smile turned predatory, "then I'll make your life here impossible. I have influence, Miss Chen. I can make phone calls that will ensure you never work in this city again. I can make Alexander's life so difficult that he'll have no choice but to choose between his business relationships and you. How long do you think you'll last when he's forced to make that choice?" Maya stared at the older woman, recognizing the truth in her threats. Elena's mother had the power to destroy both Maya's career and Alexander's social standing. She could make their lives a battleground where love would slowly suffocate under the weight of constant conflict. "I need time to think," Maya said quietly. "You have until Friday," Elena's mother replied, moving toward the door. "That gives you 3 days to make the right choice. For both of you." After she left, Maya sank into the chair she'd occupied for so many working sessions with Alexander. The study felt different now, tainted by threats and ultimatums, no longer the safe space where she'd discovered her own competence and worth. Through the window, she could see the last of the dinner guests departing, their expensive cars disappearing down the long driveway. Soon, the estate would return to its usual quiet, and she would have to face Alexander knowing that their carefully maintained professional distance had been shattered by an ultimatum that would force them both to confront the impossible mathematics of their situation. Maya had 3 days to decide whether love was worth fighting for, or whether Elena's mother was right, that some barriers were too high for even the strongest feelings to overcome. The girl everyone had called ugly was about to discover what happened when the fairy tale collided with the brutal realities of power, privilege, and a world that would never accept her as anything more than an outsider who had forgotten her place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.